In today's world, faith isn't about easy answers. Faith is about asking hard questions, following your curiosity, making a difference. At the Candler Foundry, we believe in a world in which you can consider new perspectives, find your purpose, reimagine what's possible. When we come together to learn, grow, explore, belong.
Welcome to Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory's Candler School of Theology. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring opportunities for rich theological learning beyond the walls of the seminary, making them accessible and engaging for everyone. In that spirit, this webinar series features discussions of newly published academic works that invite the broader public into the important conversations that these books engage. I'm Evie Arnold, and I'm the postdoctoral fellow and New Testament teacher for the Candler Foundry. I have the pleasure of being your Foundry host this evening. We're thrilled to have you joining us for tonight's discussion with Dr. Jennifer Snow, author of the newly published book, Mission, Race, and Empire, the Episcopal Church in Global Context. Co-sponsoring this webinar is the Episcopal and Anglican Studies program at Emory's Candler School of Theology. And so it's fitting that our moderator for this evening is the Reverend Canon John Thompson Cordy, who serves as the director of the Episcopal and Anglican Studies program and professor in the practice of church leadership here at Candler School of Theology. Reverend Canon Thompson Cordy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Evie. I'm delighted to be here. And today we are discussing the book, as you've mentioned, Mission, Race, and Empire, the Episcopal Church in Global Context by Dr. Jennifer C. Snow. This book presents a new history of the Episcopal Church from its origins in the early British Empire up to the present time, told through the lenses of empire and race. The book demonstrates the dramatic shifts within the Episcopal Church from initial colonial violence to reflective self-critique. In so doing, Dr. Snow centers the stories of groups and individuals that have often been sidelined, including Native Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, women, and LGBTQ people, as well as the institutional leaders who sought to create or fought against a church that desired to be a house of prayer for all people. Joining us for the discussion is not only the author, but two extraordinary panelists. The Reverend Dr. Arun Jones is the Associate Professor for World Evangelism at Emory's Candler School of Theology. He's my colleague. And the Reverend Dr. Wondra, Research Professor Emerita of Theology and Ethics at the Bexley Seabury Seminary. We will begin some brief remarks by Dr. Snow, and then we'll have a 40-minute roundtable conversation in which I will pose some questions for our panelists and discuss amongst themselves. You'll hear some, what you're going to hear, not some formal academic tones, if you will, but rather an organic conversation. You can think of this as a chance to be in a living room with two authors and with the author and two distinguished friends. We want to invite you into the conversation as well. At any point, you can put through questions or comments using the chat feature. Our team will collect and curate the remarks, and I'll weave the comments and questions into our conversation. Without further ado, let me introduce our author. Dr. Jennifer C. Snow is the Director of Extended Learning and Associate Professor of Practical Theology at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. Throughout Dr. Snow's career, her study of faith-based activities has inspired her to a commitment to ministries of justice, inclusion, and advocacy. In her first book, which was published in 2007, she addresses the connections between Protestant missionaries and activism in support of early Asian immigrants to the United States. Since then, she has published numerous articles and book chapters on race, religion, and immigration policy in the United States. She is committed to the congregation as a place of spiritual and justice formation and has developed a curricula on environmental justice, mission education, and immigration. Dr. Snow, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to first just express my gratitude for bringing me here. This is the first chance that I've had to talk with other people, with other scholars about the book since it's been published, but also with you. I really hope that you'll have lots of questions to ask and that you'll be part of this conversation too. The more questions we ask, the more exciting and engaging and fun our conversation will be, because just me talking is not super fun. So one of the first things that I was invited to think about when thinking about how to introduce the book was, how did this book begin? How did I come to write this book? And I was realizing that the first beginning of this book was actually a blog post that was never published that I wrote to share with my faculty colleagues at CDSP. And it was just, how did we get to this place with the divisions in the Anglican Communion? And there was a little piece of it, which I thought of as not even very interesting, which was that, there has been this massive shift in the meaning of mission during the 20th century. And there has been a division between the evangelical and the what's called the ecumenical stream of Protestant Christianity. And they were so excited about that because it was new information. And they said, oh, you should write a book about that. And I remember thinking, yeah, thank you, Dr. Jones. I remember thinking, in Game of Thrones terms, it is known. I mean, this is not new information to people that study the history of world Christianity or missions, but it is new information when taken into a denominational context, in the sense that denominational histories don't tend to address this. A denominational history tends to focus on the institution from the inside, and that changes your understanding of what the church is and who the people in the church are. So as I started to develop courses at the seminary, the first course I took was on the history of missions and the development of ecumenical Christianity. The second was on, I called it post-colonial communion, on the Anglican communion in a colonial context. And then I got to the point, okay, now I'm going to teach the Episcopal Church course. And I decided to teach the Episcopal Church course with the same approach that I had taught missions, and the same approach that I brought to the Anglican Communion, which is to look at the Episcopal Church as a missional institution that is grounded in its history. And I found so many things to draw from. And there were some books I assigned these poor students had to buy so many books, and so many of them were expensive or out of print. And I had them read many articles that I had to download because there was no single book that captured everything that I was going for. And I just wanted to, because I don't think I was able to fully credit the books that were my ground books as well as I wanted to, because we ran out. You will hear me say probably at various points in this conversation, I ran out of space. So I ran out of space for so much, including the acknowledgement section had to be drastically made more tiny. But there were 4 books that I used to basically frame this conversation. One is Yet with a Steady Beat by Harold Lewis on the history of African-American Episcopalians, which is in a missional perspective. It's a brilliant book. And it is not easy to get now, which I had to just kind of, it was costing $96 on Amazon. I couldn't force the students to buy that. But if you can get a copy of this book, I recommend it to everyone. It's a great book. The 400 Years of Mission, and that is by Awana Anderson, and it is about Episcopalian missions and Episcopalian groups among Native Americans. Also foundational. Fling Out the Banner by Ian Douglas, which looks at the missional history of the Episcopal Church kind of through the early 20th century. And The Baptism of Early Virginia by Virginia Getz. And so this is a range of different books that focus on the Episcopal Church history, more or less. I also really, Dr. Jones's book on the Episcopal missions in the Philippines was also foundational for me. I used that in the Anglican Communion, and I used that in my Episcopal Church book. And one of the things that excited me about that is that it helps you see how the Episcopal Church is both foreign and domestic, as the name says. And that makes the Episcopal Church relatively unique among Protestant churches, that it does not make a distinction between the church that is within the United States and the church that is without the United States. All of the dioceses are dioceses of the United States. And I found that people were very, very intrigued by knowing that, for instance, the Philippines, which is now an autonomous province, was originally a diocese. It was originally a missionary district and then a diocese. And Liberia and many other places that are beyond what people think of as the Episcopal Church were part of the church. They were part of the church's history. They were part of the church's identity. They were not separated as distinct places. They affected the church's trajectory over time. And the church shaped itself through these relationships. And I found that that was very, very important to bring into conversations, because if you only look at the Episcopal Church through this trajectory of General Convention and the center of the institution, you miss these things, and the church becomes an institutional history. And the narrative moves from, okay, we had the revolutionary period, we had the post-revolutionary period, we had a lot of conversation about Anglo-Catholicism, and then we have a new prayer book, and as we're done. But the living center of the church is much larger and much more dynamic and more conflicted and more unpredictable than that. And that's what I found when I started looking at the Episcopal Church through this lens of mission. I was able to see the church in a completely different way. So when I started to teach this way, I found that the students also were very, very excited about understanding their denomination and their church experience from this completely new point of view. After the very first time I taught it, I remember that a student said, "I never knew that church history could be like this," which is the best thing you can get as a teacher. I had students call me and email me after graduation saying that being able to understand this history had shifted their ability to understand their own contexts, where their churches were coming from, why their churches were where they were. It enabled them to understand better how the church got to this point in so many ways, in terms of the tensions over gender and sexuality, in terms of the conservative tensions over what mission is and what the church is and what the church should be doing. It helped them understand better why it is. We often say that the Episcopal Church is a majority white church, which I think is the case, demographically speaking. But the general answer, like, oh, it's always been that way. It's not that way by accident. it's that way because of specific historical and missional choices that have been made. And to be able to go back and look at that history and in some ways see the counterfactual possible paths that could have been taken, that we are where we are because certain choices were made, and that it is still possible to make different choices, that it is possible to learn from that history and think this is what the church could be. We see a lot of paths not taken from, if we're thinking in terms of the church, we see a lot of paths not taken when we look at the church this way. If we're looking at the church from the outside, trying to explain and understand how the church has been part of America's larger history of race and empire, this also helps us see the church in a new light, in a more complex light. We can see the places where the church has actually been actively involved in pushing forward racism, frankly, and empire, in where the church has been complicit. We also see the places where the church has raised up people, almost in despite of itself, that have tried to make the church different, that have used the church's theological resources, its liturgical resources, its history, its mission in creative ways. And the people that we often see doing that, and some of them are the missional leaders that have been well known in histories of the Episcopal Church, like William Augustus Muhlenberg, like William Reed Huntington, but others have not been centered in our conversation about the Episcopal Church's history and its mission. And Magabo, for instance, because for me is a very central figure. Joseph Brandt, James Solomon Russell, George Freeman Bragg, these incredible human beings that took the mission of the Episcopal Church and pushed it beyond where perhaps the center of the Episcopal Church wanted it to go. But we may look back and say that's the missional road that perhaps as a church we may think of going down in the future. I think that I've used my first 10 minutes now. So I think I'll stop and let's have some questions and conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This question is for the panelists. So what was the aha moment for you? What one thing stood out to you in this book that gave you some new insights or even surprised you? Dr. Jones, why don't you start, and then Dr. Wondra will respond, and then Dr. Snow can chime in.
Yeah, first of all, Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you so much for producing this book. It's a marvel in so many ways. The way it sort of weaves denominational history into a national, international history. The way it tries, it tries to understand the past in ways that give integrity to the past, and yet do not sort of let the past off the hook. So there's so many. It's a balancing act in so many different ways, and I really appreciate that. And I guess that's that's one thing that came across to me. It's not like any denominational history of a church or of mission that I've read. The question that kept on the one question I had, this was not the question that you asked the canon, but is that I was wondering why you didn't have class in there along with mission, with race and empire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that class, you talk about it a lot in the book. I mean, you don't run away from it. It's there. And I can see, if you're, for example, when I'm thinking about the Philippines and the people who became Episcopalian, I mean, it's a completely different dynamic than the United States. But I think the way that race and empire played themselves out in the Episcopal Church had a lot to do with class. And these, the race and empire were certainly there for the Methodists, the Baptists, everybody else. But I think they play themselves out differently when we consider class. And so I was just wondering about that. How class would have, if you had included, maybe it was just too much. There are too many threads there you have to draw together. I don't know.
Yeah, if I do, can I just quickly respond?
Sure.
So I honestly, on the one hand, I never thought of like doing this as a class analysis. So using class as a definite category. On the other hand, yes, there was too much. There are too many threads, and I had to cut hard, honestly.
Yeah.
There were some things that went a little more into class. One of the first big class things I noticed was actually, well, first of all, in Jamestown, who was brought to Jamestown. Not all of those people were conformist members of the Church of England. Not all of them came voluntarily, and many of them were very poor. So, like, how did they relate to the church? That is possible to trace in different eras. And it's definitely an area of research that I could have done more with more ability to tie even more threads into the complex thing.
Yeah.
But there are so many great examples. Woodmason is one example, a very excellent example of class distinctions. When Woodmason, this is just before the American Revolution, goes out to the Carolina border and is just absolutely appalled by all of these people living in cabins. And to contrast what he was seeing and was appalled by and was not at all shy about writing in his journal. And then if you look at the churches, the visual records that we have of the churches that were closer to the East Coast with their clean white walls and their highly ordered and organized pews and their rents and the very, very different physical and spiritual expectations that people coming from that higher and more educated class and wealthier class had of what their religious life should be. You can see that playing out in many, many, many contexts.
Right.
Later in the early 20th century, I did have to cut a whole research strand on the development of class consciousness and almost kind of socialist consciousness among parts of the Episcopal Church leadership. So we have the Christian socialists coming up. We have people, and they are doing it for missional purposes. So it does fit into the theme. I could have woven it in, except I did not have room. By the time I get to the early 20th century, I am really, really running out of room.
Yeah.
Fit into one book, but it is definitely there. And I know that there have been some recent publications looking at the Episcopal Church. There are a lot of really good analysis of missions in class, what kind of people, what class of people became missionaries. So there's all kinds of work out there. And I hope and pray that there are graduate students thinking, oh, I'm going to write my dissertation. There is so much room for more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Wondra, same question. What stood out? What question do you have?
Well, first of all, let me say, Jennifer, I am so happy to have this book because I've been longing for more work that will show the interaction between, to use post-colonial terms, metropole and periphery. And particularly the notion which you bring out right from the very beginning that the church, including in its institutional form, is profoundly affected and influenced by its crossing its own boundaries and engaging with others. And I think it's just a huge gift to have this book and all the footnotes, which is what I tend to read very early on. There's a remarkable breadth here and considerable depth. I really like the the way that you use particular individuals as examples to illustrate the various time periods and movements and so on. I was also astounded by the huge pool of resources you have to draw on, and knowing that there's more yet. I think this is the whole focus on mission, on interaction, on reciprocity between center and margins, and not just the effect of the center on the margins, but what's coming back, what difference does it make to those of us who are in the center, is absolutely a central focus of what theologians and historians and so on should be working on now. And I'm glad not to feel so much like a voice in the wilderness about that. It's incredibly important that particularly those of us with a great deal of privilege and an education that insists on a very narrow focus, start looking at what else was going on besides the sort of Whig narrative that we usually have of happy missionaries going to happy people and making them happier and so on and so on. It's impossible to understand the current situation if that's the way we look at it. And this gives us a whole bunch of resources and ideas to help us enrich our understanding and presumably also our practice, and to recognize the way in which the practices we have been engaging in have changed the narrative, have made that change of narrative necessary. So I'm just delighted with the whole thing.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
made me very happy.
Any comment about that, Dr. Snow?
I'm really grateful.
Okay.
I am glad. It is something that I did want to emphasize, that it was one of the things that I was, if it's a hypothesis that I was trying to prove, that the church has been shaped by the interaction with people from other places. The way that the struggle to connect with people beyond the church's established boundaries changed the church, and that whenever the church decided not to change, that's one of the paths not taken over and over again, that the church is confronted with the need to change and chooses not to, or chooses to somehow set aside the people that are now part of the church that are saying, this, let's do this differently. There's going to be some way to put those voices outside, so that they're not part of the church's decision-making structures. And you see that very clearly with the history of Black Episcopalians. Mm-hmm. That is the very, very clear example of how those voices were sidelined and how the mission of the church was minimized rather than expanded. The other thing that I wanted to come out of the church is that there is a way of looking at church history that might be less challenging, that allows us to kind of look at our heroes, look for our heroes, and feel good about our heroes. Mm. I wanted to say, okay, yes, there are heroes. There are heroes that I think are very admirable in this story, and they may not be the heroes that the Episcopal Church has always said these are our heroes. Mm. But also there's a danger in looking at the past as something that, in the past it was done right. We have always done it this way. Mm. The way the church used to be was the good way. There's a way that the past can be idolized rather than interrogated. And when the past becomes an idol, it's going to end up being one of those idols that you feed your children to. You don't get to have an idolized past without making sacrifices to truth and integrity and justice.
Right.
So I felt that it was very, very important to do this history. And this is me speaking as a member of the church. This is perhaps not the way that a purely academic point of view of doing this kind of work. But as a church member, I felt that was very, very important.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was quite intrigued by the comment, your whole conception of contextualization and how that affects the mission of the church. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because that really blew me away when I read it.
Yeah, definitely. So in a general sense, when you're looking at the history of missions or world Christianity, there's this kind of general way of speaking about contextualization, where the gospel or the church is brought to a new place and then it becomes contextualized in that new place.
Correct.
And that doesn't go into the fact that the thing that is brought is also changed. It's imagined as a thing that goes just one way. And what I wanted to really demonstrate is that, in fact, both sides are changed by this. That there is a contextualization in mission that happens to what are sometimes called the sending churches or the historic churches or the global North churches. They too are contextualizing. They are being contextualized by the experience of mission. And so what contextualization means is that the inherited practices may have to shift to meet this new reality. And that there's going to be tensions around that shift and that change. There's going to be a lot of, or often there is not a reflective or a deliberate attention to, we have to do this work, but the work has to get done. And so that's expressed in, I think, different ways in different denominational histories. In the Episcopal Church, it's to be expressed mostly through liturgical reform and general convention debates. but I think it's probably different depending on church polities, how that contextualization is developed.
I wonder if that's actually true. It seems to me, and this is actually, the what's next question, that because that we have problems with sources because of what's documented and what isn't. We have a great deal of detail, but still nowhere near as much as there could be on what goes on at General Convention. But it's abstracted a great deal from what actually happens in order to be presentable. I think at the same time, what we don't have a lot of record of is the conversations, the day-to-day interactions, the endless meetings and discussions among people who are engaged in the work, and then have to, if they're lucky, write some sort of very brief summary report. So that what we can see, it seems to me, is not very much of the surface and not very much below that. And it's, of course, dangerous to infer too much. But I want to know more about what's actually going on the ground. I want to know more about, well, just to pick one of my favorite examples, what were the actual conversations that Paul Moore and Kim Myers had in Jersey City?
Oh, yes.
Talking with, how does that work that they were engaged in, which I have thought is, it's part of why I'm an Episcopalian. How did that show up in their sermons, for example, or whatever else we have, correspondence? One of the things about certain aspects of history is that we have endless volumes of sermons and letters from certain figures. So we can sort of see what's going on behind the formal treatises or whatever. And I don't know how we can get at any of that. I really don't. but I sure wish we could.
Mm.
I want to know more about the effect that Jersey City had on Moore and Myers and Pelham. What effect starting St. Luke's had on Muhlenberg. He has a great deal to say to that, but about that we have, but there's obviously much more. And I suppose that we can't excavate all of that. In fact,
it's so interesting. Muhlenberg is very interesting because someone, I think Ann Ayers or his sister, burned all of his papers, which I find fascinating, and I really, really would like those papers. But I also, gosh, I tried so hard to find copies of the Evangelical Catholic, and I could not do it. These things are hard to find, but there are ways. There is a very good biography of Muhlenberg, which I think has gone as far as one can go into the sources. Modern urban history. So like there are ways to get to things, even when we don't have archives from a specific person. I will say that Paul Moore is a figure that needs to have a critical biography. I also toss that out there to any graduate students that may be hanging out. Jackson Kemper, I believe, has not had an official biography. And I mean, he's had like a hagiography, but not a critical modern biography. Philander Chase. Yeah. So these are people that produced a lot of stuff, but maybe all that stuff hasn't been looked at and it hasn't been put in the context of modern secondary sources. Right. But there are other people that are much harder to get to. One of the reasons that I was so grateful, James Solomon Russell's autobiography had been reissued, and there is now a museum celebrating James Solomon Russell's life in Lawrenceville, Virginia. And there are people that are working to excavate this history, and there are going to be different ways to get to different aspects of it, but there is so much more that could be done, definitely.
Thank you. Thanks. Let's bring Dr. Jones in. So, Dr. Jones, on whose bookshelf do you think this book has to be?
Well, I mean, obviously, people in the Episcopal Church, clergy, interested lay folk, people involved in mission. I think it's we've gotten to the point where we're sort of, I was talking to someone about this the other day, where we take chapters from books rather than the whole books. And I think there are chapters that would go to different places in really interesting ways. And I would assign that. And so, I could see, like in my course on mission and evangelism, a chapter on the 20th century. I think the way that the Missio Dei works out in the Anglican Church is both unique but also representative. And so, sort of, and now the United Methodists are going through our struggles, and how what we see there. So I think there are parts of it that could apply to many different groups of scholars and church people, and those involved in the study of mission. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to that, Dr. Jones. I actually tried to construct the book in such a case that chapters could be used independently. Yeah. That I each chapter could be. Arc.
Yeah. Or maybe, your chapters are really, the other thing is it's very readable. And that's really, really such a plus. I am so grateful I survived the era of scholarship purposely being non-readable. I made it through, and now it's so wonderful to see scholarship that's actually, people can pick up and read, and it's accessible, which doesn't mean it's not complicated or not complex, rather that the complexity is presented in a way that people think about it and reflect on it rather than trying to think, what is the author trying to say? Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I shout out to my copy editor. Those line edits, thank you. I tend to write very complex sentences, actually, with many commas, and you were saved from more of those. There used to be more.
Yeah. I'm in a writing group, and my writing group people say, your paragraphs are way too long. So, yeah, all of us have friends that are helping us write. Yeah.
Yes, and that's the best. That's the best.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wondra, same question for you. There's another question in the chat I would like to bring up, but who should have this book from your perspective? Who should be reading this book?
Every Episcopal seminarian.
Okay.
I would say, along with whatever is the kind of usual standard seminary text on Episcopal church history, whether that's Pritchard or something else. Now, I've been retired long enough that I don't know these things. But I think it's crucial to have this alongside the more usual stuff. I would love to have this book read by our ecumenical partners, particularly those involved in the various official dialogues at various levels. I think one of the benefits of ecumenism has been bringing to the fore some of this history and some of the current practice, but it doesn't necessarily get deliberately included in those conversations, and I think it should be. I also think, I want everybody in my church here in Sonoma County to read the stuff on California.
Yeah.
And I want everybody to read anything available about Muhlenberg. But I think the more broadly read this is, the better for all of us. And I'm very glad to hear, Jennifer, that you've structured it in a way that we can sort of pull out chapter by chapter, depending on the context. I think about what we're doing in the congregation I'm associated with about land recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want us to look at what happened with the vaunted gold rush and this and that and the other. So I think I wish that this book could be widely read. I'm afraid under the current regime, culturally, it's not going to be read as anywhere near as broadly as it deserves. But I think if the more that we can sort of get the word out. Speaking of which, I'm doing a review essay on this for the ATR, which I hope will help. I enjoyed reading it, and I am not an historian.
Yeah.
So I think, that's worth saying loud and often. That, as you said, Dr. Jones, it's accessible, it's readable, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's wonderfully informative. It's also, I think it also tells us some things about how to be generous about the past as well as critical. And I particularly love the observation that you make a number of times, Jennifer, about how people who were trained up to work in the settled East, where everybody knew what they were doing, simply didn't have the skills or the imagination to do anything other than this trial and error. And I think recognizing that it's trial and error and why that's the case is enormously helpful for those of us now who are sort of making it up as we go along.
Thank you. So there's a question for Dr. Snow. It says, can you reflect on any counterfactuals in relation to the present? In other words, in 50 to 100 years, what will people be looking back at regarding this period of church history and asking what will be different from if they had done X instead of Y?
I think that's such a good question, and it's really hard to obviously predict the future. But I think one thing that that we may consider is did the church adequately address the meaning of the congregation, the meaning and function of the congregation? Have we just doubled down on the congregation? It looks like this, and it's in a church, and it has like, you know, a full-time clergy person, as though that's the way we've always done it. And that there is always, you know, that there is, it has to be a certain way because we've always done it this way. When in fact we've done it like since 1960 in this way. and have we been able to adequately delve into the reality of how people are developing relationships in this context, this missional context, with new forms of communication, with new challenges, with new ways that people spend their time? How are we building communities in ways that fit this time? And so I don't actually know, because I'm not part of, you know, anything important in terms of church decision-making processes, what might be on the table for that. But I do think that 50 or 100 years from now, they will look back and say, in this time of incredible social change, did the church, did the Episcopal Church choose a path where there was flexibility, openness, and support for developing communities that might look different from one another, that might all not be the same, that fit different local contexts and local needs? And so that's something that I wonder about. And it's not because I think, oh, if we do this one right thing, then everything will be good. I do not know like what right answer there might be, but I do know that there's definitely a lot changing, and there's a lot changing about community and about how people relate to one another. And that is something that I think needs a lot of attention.
Got it.
I was, one thing that struck me really towards the end of the book, twice, Jennifer, you say that the Missio Dei group was shocked at what happened. And the counterfactual, and it was obvious to me that the Missio Dei had lost touch with what was happening around the world. And the counterfactual I would ask is, what would have happened if the folks involved in the Missio Dei had not simply looked at the USA as the focus of mission, but continued to look globally? Mission globally. What, you know, would things have worked out differently as opposed to the alignments that are happening, you know, that eventually happened, which I really don't think tell the whole truth of what's happening in the global church.
Right.
In fact, this is true of the Methodists, of which I'm a part. The predominantly white Methodist Church still creates the categories which are used by everyone else to define ourselves and themselves. You know, we're not scrambling the categories. And until we scramble the categories, we're not going to see how the church has really changed in the 20th century, early 21st century. But,
I would say that I also, you know, certainly like one of the counterfactuals, like I have going back, has been like the resistance to ecumenical relationships that has come up at various points in the history. But I do wonder, you know, what if the Missio Dei Center had done two things, as Bishop Stephen Bain emphasized, to do that theological work so that the people in the churches also understood the theological changes that were happening. that it didn't feel like something coming top down that was alien and that was, ruining their church. That instead, that in the 50s, in the 60s, that theological work had been done, and that building and educating of the community had happened. The other thing I wonder about is as you said, like if the shift to Missio Dei had not also meant a shift away from developing missional relationships, where it moved instead towards sending development experts, but not building relationships over time, where that relational aspect of mission basically went away. So yes, I also wonder about that was a path not taken, to say we still need to be there. We still need to have these relationships, and they cannot just be relationships that are about secular experts and secular development. It has to be not just giving money and resources, but also building relationships.
In essence, missionaries are going to places to fix problems, basically, to help those poor people, rather than interact and build strong relationships and be affected by the context in which they find themselves. Thank you. That's brilliant. Dr. Wondra, you have a comment about that question that was put in the chat?
Yes, again, this is an area where I think there's a lot more work to be done than has been done. I was thinking as Dr. Snow and Jones were speaking about the Partners in Mission program that began in part because there was this sense that we were out of touch, and the companion diocese relationships and so on. I don't often hear very much about what's going on with those, except occasionally at diocesan convention. And yet, I think when those are working well, they are building relationships over time, and around issues that matter to folks not in the U.S. As well or more than. Anyway, there are other people's issues that we get invited to engage with, and I think it would be helpful to look at that if it's possible. I think also part of the counterfactual question is not just in what ways would the church have been different or could have been different, but also the larger social context.
Yes, absolutely.
The extent to which the Episcopal Church has been perceived, certainly back east, as totally aligned with the elite, which of course is not the case once you get past the Alleghenies, pretty much. But what else is going on in society? What else are our Episcopal lay people up to that they then bring into the decision making? And I think, one of the great examples here is the Church Pension Fund, how that influenced the development of Social Security. And that's because of Episcopal lay people who we don't think of necessarily as acting in a missional fashion. I think that's enough.
Well, thank you.
I'm about to go on forever.
There's a lot.
Minutes. So here's one last question for the panelists. What one thing did you wish that Dr. Snow would have addressed? What one question do you have for her tonight? So let's start with Dr. Jones. One question.
I don't know. I guess I started off my reflections with my question about class, but I'll pass for just now. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me think about that. Yeah.
Dr. Wondra?
I would really like to hear more about the role of women in the mission field. I know there's a lot of work been done, and nobody can do everything in one book. God knows we try. But I think that's another important strand. I was very struck by the discussion of the Philadelphia ordinations and the conjunction of that church and these women, and the way in which that was in certain ways appears to be incredibly transgressive, but also very helpful as an example. So what do we hear from some of the not as well-known folks about what they're encountering, how that's changing them, how they're able then to bring that back? And in general, how does the missionary experience, however we understand it, affect people after they come back and their interactions with folks here? I know that that it doesn't seem to be very much in certain ways, but I think it's interesting. Anyway.
Any comments on that, Dr. Snow?
Yeah, I just want to say yes to that space. and I also, at a certain point, I had to say, okay, work has been done on this, so I can't give space to it. But yeah, there's so much that could have been done on women, on the deaconess movement, much that's just not there. There's also stuff that I don't think there has been work done on, and I could not get space to do it. And so there were whole realms of things that in an ideal and perfect book would have been there. And so I'm just going to list some of the ones that are high on my list in the hope that a graduate student will take them up. So one is the Navajo. I did a lot of work on the Navajo, could not incorporate it. The missions in Alaska.
Yes.
There's actually a huge amount of stuff. You can do that work. There's a lot of archival material, but I could not fit it in. And more detail, I think, to the whole shift in the 20th century. Again, the 20th century is lean and mean in this book because I just had. I'm sure you can tell that the richness of the stories. There could have been so much more on Pauli Murray. I mean,
of course,
there could have been so much more. There could have been so much more. I think will be the final thing that you watch from this. So there are a few things. I know we only have 2 more minutes, but there's a few comments, and can I try to answer some of the comments that I'm seeing?
Sure.
Okay. So first of all, Dr. Bishop Douglas, thank you for being here. I love your book. It's one of the things that I considered one of my framing books. The question of the definition of mission I use in this book is not a theological definition. It's a working definition that basically is just enabling me to pull a single thread through 4 centuries or however many centuries it is. So it's just allowing me to focus the work on saying, this is what I will look at. This is the thread I will pull. And so, of course, like in terms of the theological context of Missio Dei, it starts falling apart. The thread becomes harder to follow as the Missio Dei vision of mission develops. And mission is much more the question of how does the mission relate to the congregation? That is actually one of the theological questions I feel continues to be not fully addressed. And so I did not try to address it, but I just continued, clunking along in my little working definition just to get through to the end of the 20th century into the 21st. And possibly in the 21st century, that theological need will be met, that we will develop this new way of connecting the Missio Dei theology to the mission of the congregation and the church in a way that is more satisfying and rich, and that people can work with, I think, as members of the church.
Right.
And then I know we're at 5 o'clock. Can I just finish these last few questions? Because I really want to honor that people brought their questions. Francisco Garcia, thank you. I was surprised by so many stories. The resistance to and complicity with empire. I think the conversation about Bishop Whipple is a really, really interesting one. Because on the one hand, there's no denying that he saw himself and was seen as and was a supporter and friend to the Plains tribes, and especially to the Lakota. And at the same time, there is a very strong historical argument to be made that he was complicit in some of the land theft that went on, because he believed, he was very paternalistic. He believed he knew what was best. And he believed that what was best was actually incorporation into something that he did not call an empire, but that theologically and functionally was an expanding empire. And so he supported that. He was part of that. And so he was both. Another fantastic one, Alexander Crummell.
Yeah.
Oh, God, I love Alexander Crummell. There should be books written about Alexander Crummell. What an amazing man. Such resistance. And yet sometimes there was also complicity. That he was, in fact, he spoke on behalf of the American Colonization Society, that he worked in Liberia and brought some of the same ethnocentric ideals of some of the less savory missionaries into the Liberian context. And so those are, you see this complexity. And you see this richness. Nobody is simple. And so there is often resistance and complicity in the same person, because they're embedded in a very complex historical structure, as are we all. And I would say that my favorite story is the story of, possibly my favorite story that I love, is the story of St. Thomas African Church in Philadelphia, and how they fought and pushed back to be included in diocesan convention. And I think I put in their entire snapback after, which is well worth reading. Or seriously, people, seriously, we can't believe we knew you thought it. We can't believe you said it. And it's just brilliant. It's brilliant. So I love that story.
Thank you.
Okay. Kyle Lamblay. How do I think about the role of history? I think the role of history is really, really, really central, because there are different ways that we can fall into fundamentalism and oppression. And one of the very basic ways is that we fall into a fundamentalist view of history, where we don't look at it and we don't interrogate it, and we don't look at our inheritance, whatever that may be. We are all inheriting this history, and not looking at it carefully and not seeing how it has shaped us can make us think of history as something that has to be worshipped and kept in a certain form. We're afraid of our history. And theologically, I think as a Christian, we should not be afraid of history. We can look at that history. We can delve into it. We have nothing to be afraid of to look at that history. And we should and must look at it, so that we don't fall into the same patterns again, and that we don't worship something that does not deserve to be worshipped. And Taylor, families who chose not to have their children baptized. I'm not exactly sure what the question is you meant to ask, Anne, because you ran out of space there. But I would say that there's always ways, whatever your context is, to reach out to families that have children that have not been baptized but would like to join the community, and that would have to be based on the context in which you're working. Terry Hoffman, thank you for saying nice things, Terry and Cheryl. Oh, there we go. Oh, got it. Okay, so Anne, I saw the rest of your question. So the Catholic Church, why do they have CCD filled every Wednesday night? I imagine, first of all, it's a much larger church. Second, so, numbers do work, proportion is real. Secondly, having grown up Catholic myself, I think that there is a very, very strong emphasis on preparation for the sacraments, and that is expected, and everyone in the church does that. So that there are a good amount of books out there that compare different formation methods and formation expectations in different religious groups. So one that is very interesting is Almost Christian by Kendra Casey Dean. And it just kind of shows almost at a very, very almost extreme level in a way, because the entire community is doing it, but that when adults in a community expect to be involved in the religious education of their children, they themselves are able to express their faith. And it is important, and they give time every day, every week to doing that religious education, then that becomes an expectation of the community. And so people will be more involved in it. So just in a general sort of way. And thank you, Ian, for nice things. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have, and we are 5 minutes over time.
Thank you. I apologize for not seeing the comments on my screen until you brought that to my attention. Thank you all very much. A big thank you to Dr. Jones and Dr. Wondra for being here on our panel. And I want to thank the Candler Foundry for making this happen, Dr. Ryan Bonfiglio and his entire staff, especially Evie and Krista and Pearl, and also to Dr. Pullen Kwok, whose vision it was to make this a reality. So thank you, Dr. Kwok, for making it.
Thank you so much.
And to all of you, thank you again. Please know that the Foundry always has some critical information that will benefit you in your faith development. Until then, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you all so much.